are a couple of things left over from last week which I did not finish. I want to mention briefly tonight before we continue, and that is the water supply. The water supply to Jerusalem was very critical, especially during the times of the three great feasts, when, depending on population estimates, some people have guessed, and that's all it is, that on the three great feasts, when all the Israelites were to assemble in Jerusalem, that the city could have increased in population by 300,000 to 500,000. It's just a guess. But especially during that time, water would be very critical for a couple of reasons. We talked briefly last week about the discoveries that they are excavating now on the west side of the Temple Mount. The ritual baths, many of them been uncovered because all those pilgrims that had come for the feast would take a ritual bath, and that took water. And of course, during the feast, especially the feast when multitudes of animals were slaughtered, that took water too. We'll talk about a little bit about later on what it meant to see what was going on in the temple during the slaughtering of the animals. So you had to have a water supply, and so there were approximately 50 miles of aqueducts that wound through the Judean hills north of Jerusalem. One of the main ones was collected southwest of Bethlehem, and strangely enough, pools that were called Solomon's pools, three of them, stair-step down the side of a hill, not built by Solomon, but they called them Solomon's pools. And those three pools were used as part of the water supply of Jerusalem even into the 20th century. But that water, at times, it was what you would ordinarily assume an aqueduct would be, winding around the hills, crossing valleys. But the Romans learned from someone that if you tunneled through a hill in which there was an aquifer, naturally you picked up more water because the aquifer flowed into the tunnel that you dug, and so many of the tunnels were dual purpose, and so water was brought into Jerusalem. And in the handout which you have, if everyone got with the black and white picture, it's not real good. It was in color on the internet. I edited it to black and white, but if you look in the lower right-hand corner of that picture, below the temple, southwest corner of the temple, you see this concave basin, and that represents, and they have uncovered parts of it, that represents the fact that they had a basin for collecting the clean water. What happened to the dirty water, I haven't been able to find out, but the water where the sacrificial animal's blood was washed off had, of course, to be kept separate from the clean water. The clean water from rainwater from the runoff of the temple courts could be reused further downhill in the valleys for farming, etc. But that's a little bit about the water supply. But going on tonight, this is just for information to give you an idea. It's not clear. You can look at it on the internet tomorrow and see a clear picture. But in the lower right-hand corner of this picture, you will see a comparison. There's a little rectangle. That's a football field. Okay? The big double squares next to it represents the sanctuary, the holy place, the most holy place in the court of the priests in Israel and the court of the women. In other words, the area that Gentiles could not enter. It takes approximately 3.5 American football fields to cover that holy place that Gentiles could not enter. So that gives you an idea of how big the place was. When you think about a football field, and there's very little area outside of the buildings that are in that area. So that gives you an idea of the size that we're going to be talking about. Now, in particular, tonight we want to try and climb the hill. We talked about last week the foundation stones of digging down to bedrock and then building those huge walls over 200 feet high on the east side and on the west side, excuse me, over 100 and something feet high. So we had the walls up, we have a platform. Now we're going to build a temple on top of it. And when it was built, how did worshipers get up to the temple? The west side where the Wailing Wall is now, I told you last week, that is about 40 feet above the present surface, about 40-something feet above where the roadway was. That roadway was the main north-south road through to Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. And so people would be coming in from the north or south. That was the main road. And so there are many entrances on that west side and on the south side. There are entrances on the picture. You'll see there are gates, and some of those gates we know practically nothing about. They've been walled up, they've collapsed or whatever through the years. But we do know, if you look on your picture now of the drawing, this is a view from the southwest corner of the Temple Mount. And as you can see, there is right at the southwest corner, there is a grand staircase we talked about a little bit. It goes up and over that north-south corridor street along the west side of the Temple Mount through one of the biggest arches. Some people have, I read somewhere a long time ago, that those two arches, that and Wilson's Arch, further down toward the north, are two of the biggest Roman arches that we know of, 40-something feet. To build this one, the valley was so deep at this one on the southwest corner, the Romans actually built a mountain there, filled in the valley, built a mountain, built the arch, and then dug it all out. That's how they built that arch. It's like I say, it's about 42 or 43 feet. Of course, it was a circular arch. The Romans did not build pointed arches. Now, if you go further up the west wall toward the north, there is another arch. That arch is called Wilson's Arch. It was discovered by the fellow that did the map we looked at last week of the topography of Mount Moriah before it was all built up with the temple structure. So we have two arches, Robertson's Arch and Wilson's Arch, going from south to north. So we're looking along this from the southwest corner. Now, to look at where the videos are going to take us, if we look now to the right of Robinson's Arch, you will see the tremendous south wall, and you will see two black spaces there as you go up the grand staircase along that south wall, and further on you will see three black spaces. Those are the mole gates. I call them the gopher gates, but the Jews called them the mole gates because they're underground. And so along this southwest corner, if you went along that south wall, if you didn't go up and over the arch there at the corner, you could go toward the east and you could go in through one of the mole gates. Now they're doubled, and these are at least one pair of them have been photographed recently, and some of the details and the videos we will see are really more representative of reality and detail than a lot of the imaginary things we have to just suppose it looked like. But the mole gates went up by a series of steps, and you came out when you went up and made all the way up to the top of the temple, to the court of the Gentiles. You came out and you were just a little bit north of this grand portico that ran all along that south wall. And that's where we want to end up tonight in our videos. This is called the Royal Portico. It was, according to all accounts, one of the most grand edifices ever built in the time of Christ. Josephus, the historian and Jew who was a pal of the Romans and watched the temple be destroyed, said, and he had seen Rome in all of its glory in those days, he said this royal portico surpassed anything that he saw in Rome. He considered it the most beautiful building ever built. How was it built? Well, as you can see from this black and white illustration, it had 4 rows of columns. Josephus says there were 162 of them. And the problem is 162 is not divisible by 4. And the explanation is there were 3 rows of standing columns. The 4th column was a half column embedded in that wall that you see facing that south wall. And so you have three standing columns in a row. The beams resting then on a half column embedded in the wall on the south side. And unlike the rest of the courtyard of the temple and the porticos around it, this is a triple portico. The others just had 2 rows of freestanding columns around the rest of the court of the Gentiles. This one has 3. Now, and having 3, then we can have an upper bay, which is raised above the 2 side bays, and it had windows. And there are 2 representations of this portico, and most of them that I have seen represent the portico as being tiled with a sloped tile roof. Some representations say it had a flat roof. If you won't believe it, but the Romans covered the roof of the sanctuary was concrete. They poured concrete for the roofs of many of these buildings, and more about that later. And so some people represent this royal portico as just having 2 flat roof on each side, and the raised portion in the middle having a flat roof. So whether it had tile or was flat, I don't know. I think it's logical that it would have tile, but there's 2 opinions about that, like so much of the detail of the temple. But now if we go back, let's go back to the southwest corner again before we see the video. If we go along the west wall, there toward the north, you see there's another arch. This is Wilson's arch, and this was about the same size as Robinson's and goes across the valley, which is a little bit more shallow there, and goes across the valley and gives an entrance closer to the sanctuary and the area where the priests would be going in. And so these 2 arches and their causeways gave access from the city of Jerusalem on the south side, on the west side. The south side, we have the 2 pair of mole gates. The mole gates are double. The corridors are double inside. Now, the one on the far east side here, if you go toward the east, which you can see that is called the triple gate, that was not original. The Romans would never have done that. They would never have built double on one side and triple gate on the other. The stonework around the triple gate shows that it was added later. It has characteristics of Arabian or Muslim architecture that shows that it was modified. And you could go in there at least at one time, and inside, the corridors look inside just like the double gates further to the south. So that was 2 ways to get in. There was a gate on the north, apparently the temple. You can't find much about it. I spoke briefly about the east gate. It was mainly ceremonial, and because after all it's on kind of the outside outskirts of the city, facing the Mount of Olives. But these 2 sides of the temple were the really high traffic areas for people coming and going on the feast days when there was an absolute mob of people coming and going in and out of the temple complex. About the royal portico, I talked about how many columns. Josephus also says it was a Roman stadium, in our language, a stadium, in length, and so people have doubted that. A Roman stadium is 606.9 English feet. A Roman stadium is 625 Roman feet. Roman feet were smaller than English feet. And so Josephus said that, and so people have wondered if he often exaggerated, especially about things about his nation. As he would try to curry favor with the Romans, he was also trying to, at times at least, to leave a favorable impression of his nation. And so people have wondered if that was really true, how long it was. Now, last week we looked that the Temple Mount on that south side, the present wall is about 927 feet. If the royal portico was 606.9 feet approximately, then there is a chance, as the drawing shows, to have a grand entrance porch on each end that would be separated, a grand gate house, if you will, that will be separated from the royal portico, because there's too much space there. We've got several hundred feet to cover, and it turns out from archaeological studies, when the the Arabs decided to build an unauthorized staircase and threw a lot of the Temple Mount over the side and hauled it off to the dump. The Jews, about 15 years ago, started the Temple Mount sifting project of sifting the approximately 4,500 tons of rubble that the Muslims threw off the Temple Mount because they decided they needed another entrance, emergency exit or entrance to the mosque on top. And so in the sifting of all that, we'll talk about some of the things that have been found, but what they have found is parts of the frieze which belong to the royal portico. Now, if you're not an architectural nut, let me tell you what a frieze is. In classical Greek or Roman architecture, anytime you have two columns or two posts holding up something, going back to the Egyptians found about the longest distance you could have between two columns is about 10 feet. It's hard to find stone that you can handle and strong enough to span more than about 10 feet. And so in the sifting of all this debris that the Muslims threw off the Temple Mount to build their an extra entrance and exit to that mosque on top, they have found parts of the frieze that apparently was part of the royal portico because of where the dirt came from. It came from that side of the Temple Mount. And so the nice thing about classical architecture is that things repeat, and the Romans were great at repeating things. So if you have a design that repeats every whatever distance those columns are in that portico, the design is repeating in the frieze. Well, what's the frieze? You have columns. The stone that goes across any two posts in classical architecture is called the architrave. Now, above, what's above that? Well, you have the roof has to be held up. You have to have a ceiling, and so the beams of the ceiling are resting on the architrave, but you don't want them sticking out and so you carve thin stone panels along that cover up the ends of the rafters and the beams of the roof. And so they repeated it every regular interval, and they got enough fragments from this Temple Mount sifting project. It was regular, it repeated every time, and you get enough different pieces, especially with computer graphics now, you can actually work out the design, and they got the spacing. And it turns out that the spacing between the columns on center was 3.25 meters. That is exactly 10.66 feet. And so if you put that together with how many rows of columns there were, guess what you come up with? Anyone want to guess? You come up with one Roman stadium just like Josephus said. And the wonders of architecture and archaeology. And so he was right about at least about that. So you have a building now that is about 607 feet long. Now, it wasn't just plain. The columns, those 162 columns, were marble. They had capitals at the top. The beams were carved. The roof beams were carved. The space of the ceiling was painted. The roof beams were carved elaborately. The painting of the ceiling was elaborate. And as we'll see later from some examples, the floor was probably tile like we talked about briefly last week, with that inlaid stone tile that had been imported made with stones from all over the world. And so it was a wonderful thing, and Josephus did not exaggerate when he described it as being one of the most beautiful buildings he'd ever seen. So let's talk if you want to Google something interesting, Google the Temple Mount Sifting Project. As of this morning, when I looked, they've been at it for 15 years. They've had 3,520 tons of material they've sifted. Now, because so many of the artifacts are tiny things like coins and like that, they wet sift it, which means usually when you're digging an archaeological dig, have a screen and you get rid of the rocks and you sift and try to collect things. Well, they're wet sifting because many of the things they're looking for have been so encrusted with dirt for so many years that you have to wet sift them just to see that you just don't have a clod of dirt, that there may be actually something that piece of dirt you're looking at has buried inside it. So they're wet sifting all this material. And so they have from that 1,520 tons. They think about 1,000 tons left to sift. They have 204,500 people have volunteered to help sift all that material. A lot of them are students, college students, and people just interested in the history of Israel and helping just as volunteers. They estimate they have 500,000 artifacts that they've uncovered from that. Of course, pieces of stonework, pieces of tile from that sifting project. The floor we talked about last week again, the tiles. The tiles of the temple were 1 Roman foot squared. And this was typical of Herod's building projects. Herod had, or his architect, had a love of what's called Herod's triangle. And many of the tile pieces have been recovered, even from his palace at Jericho, Masada, other places. Herod's triangle was a triangle in which the height was equal to the base. And many of the stone pieces that they've recovered from the sifting project are just like the pieces that have been recovered from Masada and other of Herod's building projects. They have that Herod's triangle as part of them. The stone used, they've identified stone from all over. The black stones that were used for accent came from the area of the Dead Sea where there's chalk that is black with bitumen. And that was the black. And then there are all kinds of marble and other kinds of stone, the white, calcium carbonate, the limestone around Jerusalem. The white color is often from Jerusalem because it's an alabaster, they're alabaster. And there's whole categories, and they know where all these things came from. And because of Herod's triangle being so prevalent, they know these are not later tiles that the Muslims or someone else had added to the Temple Mount later. These are some of the restored tiles they had found from the pieces that the Muslims threw off the Temple Mount. You see the pinwheel in the lower right-hand corner. That was a very favorite Roman tile design. They're each 1 Roman foot squared, which is 10.8, I think, inches. And you see the various designs. There are others that I found today but did not add to the slides that are even more elaborate than these. They found all these pieces, and they found the ones that were, of course, in good shape. They fit together so closely, the archaeologists say you can hardly insert a tip of a sharp knife between the pieces. Now, these were all made by craftsmen. You think about grinding things this precisely so they exactly fit, and covering great amounts of the temple. Don't know how much of it. Josephus talks about the courts being paved with wonderful colored stones. More than likely, these very expensive ones would have been used in the sanctuary, in the court of the women, the court of the Israel, and the court of the priest, for sure, and the royal portico probably. But as far as the court of the Gentiles, it's hard to fathom that even Herod had enough money to pave the court of the Gentiles with this sort of paving. It was just too expensive. But fantastic, some genius worked out a computer program that took all these pieces and figured out how some of them would fit together. And so they're very similar to other Herod's palace and other building projects. So these all came down from that rubble that they threw off the mountain for their extra set of stairs. We start at the bottom. Let's take this down. At the bottom of the staircase and go. It shows looking down the street toward the north, and you'll see if you look carefully on the video, they show there are shops along that western wall. If you look at your drawing. The stairs that run along the western wall, there were shops there. As we talked about, they're uncovering those now. There are shops all along there. They show the staircase. And instead of going up the staircase, they just suddenly pop into the portico, and you see, looking down the royal portico at the columns, and they show that the beams, you can see a little bit of the beams and the painted ceiling. And then they look out of the portico, they turn and look out toward the temple itself. When we think about the royal portico, all three of the synoptic gospels mention, of course, in the last weeks of Jesus' life for his crucifixion, about the driving the money changers out of the temple and the sellers of animals and everything. And all the synoptics mention that. And it probably took place in the royal portico, because this was a marketplace. It was where business was conducted in the city of Jerusalem. It was not part of the temple, but Jesus, and you have to look at what Jesus said, I think, very carefully. He said what? It was written that his Father's house was to be a house of prayer, but they had made it a den of thieves. And this was not a holy place. But the thing that is important when you read the synoptics is that the thieving part, because it was common knowledge that when you went to Jerusalem, you had to have sacrifices. If you didn't bring the sacrifice, if you didn't have your sacrifice that you were coming to, you had to buy it. And of course, if more people showed up than usual, supply and demand, the price probably went up. And so when Jesus said that they'd made it a den of thieves, this was a marketplace. City business was conducted there. The Sanhedrin met part of the time in the outer courts instead of the court of Israel, and so I think the significant thing there was there was a lot of thievery going on. You had to change your money. You couldn't use a Roman coin to pay your temple tax. Now you could use a coin that they sometimes minted themselves, but you could also use Tyrrhenian coin. If you had Tyre coinage, that was okay, because after all, who helped David and Solomon build the first temple? King of Tyre. And so you could change your filthy Roman money for the coin of Tyre, and that was okay. But again, what happened? Well, there was a great profit. You had to change your money. And so when Jesus said you made it a den of thieves, there was a lot of that going on. Now, after the destruction of the temple in 70 and the later Jewish revolts, one thing that happened is they stormed the money changers and they burned all their records of the money changers. So that got rid of that loan if you burned the record.